We want to send a special thank you to Bailey Pottery Equipment and Ceramic Supply for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. At Bailey, you get the very best products along with extensive product information and excellent prices. In every line of equipment, you'll find functional features that teachers and professional potters have come to depend on. At the Bray, our Bailey gas kilns are the preferred choice among artists who create large work because they're easy to fire and very reliable. If you want to go big, go Bailey. For more information, visit baileypottery.com. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 408 of the podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today on the show, I talk with Sanam Emami. She is a professor of pottery at the Colorado State University and makes beautiful work. I've been a fan of hers for quite a while, so it's good to have her on the show. In this interview, we talk about the history of tulips and how that informed her making of the tulipier, as well as how she plays with revealing and concealing in her surface design. If you'd like to see examples of her work, you can go to sanamemami.com. Sana will be participating in the Pottery to the People 21st Annual Exhibition of the Artstream Nomadic Gallery. That's going on now with regular updates of new work from all the folks that are participating, happening March the 10th and the 13th. You can shop at art-stream.com. Along that topic, NCECA is coming up right around the corner. That's happening next week. And if you stop at the Archie Bray booth, you can get a free poster for the Brickyard Network. We currently have 5 shows that I hope you guys are all listening to, and we're going to be having 2 new ones that are going to drop in either late April or early May. So make sure to check all of that out at brickyardnetwork.org. Before we get to this interview, I also wanted to thank the folks that donate to this podcast. We are listener supported, so I'd like to thank Jane Britz, Virginia Piazza, and Judith Oppenheimer for their contributions. If you'd like to get involved yourself, you can do that at patreon.com/redclayrambler. or talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. I'm really interested in how trade goods affect ceramic form, and I heard a lecture of yours, and you were talking about how tulips and the trade, or the maybe theft of tulips from the Middle East into Europe, really became a driving force for ceramic form. So can you tell a little bit about the history of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just love history in general. My undergraduate degree was in history, and so I've always been so curious about looking to the past and then making these connections and then how they influence where we are now. And so when you mentioned and there's a lot of really interesting research right now among scholars about sort of the way we perceive our economy and sort of economic values in relation to all these different histories. And of course, ceramic history played a huge role in not only advancing technology and innovation, but how we think about the marketplace. But tulips in particular are really woven into that history of economics and also the history of ceramics and also so many other histories. But when I was in graduate school, the way I sort of became interested was, I spent quite a bit of time, as many grads at Alfred do, in the library, just because the library is such an amazing place with books of work, like ceramic pieces I just hadn't been familiar with. But I also think right around the first year of grad school, I was visiting a family in San Francisco, and there's a lot of really great small museums in San Francisco. And in the basement of one of my favorite little museums, there's these 2 4-foot long tulip vases. And that was the first time I had seen those forms. And so I came back to school and was interested in just kind of figuring out, like, well, what are these things? Why were they made? Who were they made for? And just the research was really interesting because it was actually hard to find specific information for a long time about the tulip vase, but there was so much written about tulips. Now I feel like there's more about the tulip vase as well. I mean, I think lots of people were looking at the pots, but I couldn't connect the history to the pots. But at the time I read a book called Tulip Mania, and it was written by an economist, and he talked about tulips as the first bull market in history. And I was like, wait, what? and it's interesting. It's a little bit, the tulip story feels a little bit like the Arcanum story. There's this sort of just all the things that make up a good story. There's like the royalty, and there's a power play, and who's guarding their secrets. But tulips were found, or sort of originated in the wild in the central steppes of Asia. And it was the Turks and the court of the Sultan that first domesticated tulips. But from my research, it sounds like a European ambassador was visiting the courts and smuggled bulbs to Europe. So that's really an interesting way that the flowers got to Europe. And then, of course, the tulips just kind of evolved and changed, and I think became part of Dutch culture. And over time, I just always connected tulips with Holland and the Dutch. But in the 17th century, there was just not a lot of information like we have now about the way that flowers, like the way that colors break, and the way that, you can modify or control those things. And so tulips were still pretty rare, and they just became like porcelain, like gold. They just became a really valuable commodity. And for some reason, people became obsessed with them, and would sort of hedge bets on like when the colors would break, when they would be solid. And they didn't really know. So they would try to do things like adding dye to the soil. And anyway, just lots of crazy things that are really inventive and creative. But essentially, it started this tulip craze, and it seems like it started small, and then it grew, and then it grew. But the value of the tulip just kept going up and up and up, and people just kept wanting them more. And so you hear these stories about people quitting their jobs or selling their houses for a flower. And like, I guess I'm not an economist, but the simple thing was that, the price went up and up and up. And then one day there's a bunch of guys, and of course it was guys, sitting around a pub, and somebody must have been like, this is crazy, and like didn't bid up again, and the whole market like crashed. So there was that side of it. But parallel to that, you have the sort of economy of the royalty or the aristocracy, and at this time, these beautiful, complicated tulip vases were being built and designed. And they're so interesting because some of them, I think, are for cut flowers, some of them are for bulbs. But the idea that each flower had its own spout, for me, became a really compelling, both like conceptual, it just sort of gave me a conceptual way, a framework to think about how I wanted to make things. but also just how, as a culture or as society, we value things, right? Um, and as a potter who's interested in function, I feel like the tulip vase, like designing tulip vases in grad school. So as I was reading all this stuff and I was thinking about what I wanted to make, and I sort of felt like the tulip vase allowed me to stay within a certain parameter that I really enjoy working in, but also it was really kind of anything I wanted it to be as long as it held flowers. So that was kind of the parameter. And so I did spend quite a bit of time like thinking about, okay, like what was the ideas of like trade, and how did the tulip end up in Europe, and how did these Delft tulip vases come to be? But once I had a understanding of that, and I will mention the period that tulip vases were made was really small, and I still can't quite get if it was the market crashing or just the styles changing, because really quickly after that, the style of ceramics in Holland changed, and it was years later that tulip vases were made again. So for 100 or 200 years, they even the Dutch weren't interested in them. But I was really interested in them. And then once I realized that the flowers originated in the Middle East, I decided just as a premise or just a starting point for my thesis work to remake the tulip vase, but using Islamic, Middle Eastern, Iranian architecture as the kind of guide for the form. And then just kind of playing with that. And in some ways, the history of the tulip vase felt also like the history of the Silk Road. So again, all of these things that were being exchanged amongst cultures. So for me, the tulip vase, it's interesting. It's like a really specific thing. But what I love about it is that it took many cultures and many sort of almost like a collective effort and a whole set of things to happen to result in this object, or even in the flower. And that also was an interesting sort of conceptual thread. So those are all things that made the tulip vase really fun to play with. And just I could just make those. I mean, I love making lots of different things, but I sort of feel like I would love to just spend a year making tulip vases, because there's just so much you can do with it.
I'm so interested when cultures come together, as you've mentioned, and give a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and then there's a new hybrid that's neither one or the other. It's like this new thing. But what's interesting in the way we're taught history is that often hybrids are categorized as one thing, because it's just the way history is taught. It's like it's easier to put someone in a category and say the tulip vase is Dutch, even though without the tulips, it wouldn't be a tulip vase, you know? So I'm interested in this hybridity and how that comes into your work, because I see that a lot in later works, like post that grad school period. So can you talk about yourself as a intellectual being a hybrid, like how you've drawn in different influences and then how you put them into the work?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think about that stuff all the time. You know, even going back to the tulip vase, you know, without cobalt, the Chinese, which comes from the Middle East, the Chinese wouldn't have been able to make blue and white ware. But without the Chinese, like just incredible innovation and discovery of porcelain and the blue and white wares, then all that work in Europe wouldn't have happened. So the Dutch needed the tulips, they needed the Chinese blue and white influence, they needed the cobalt. I think, you know, this is interesting. I think part of it goes back to just maybe how how one sees the world. I think as a historian or studying to be a historian, that was something that always interested me. Even as a student, I remember being drawn to the history major because, except for having to take like early American and like having to take the American history courses, I was in college in the early 90s, and it was kind of the beginning of social history, women's history, thinking about like African American history, Native American history. Howard Zinn, I'm always think like that was when he published People's History of the United States. And I think that my academic training really started at that moment. And I kind of looked at history through this lens that there's a lot of stories that we didn't include because either, history is written by the victor, or it's just like you said, it's easier to just keep it specific and simple. But somebody was picking and choosing what would be in the history. And it's been really interesting in the cultural moment that we're in now, rethinking like being a student almost 30 years ago and what that felt like then and what it's continued to feel like, and trying to chip away at it. But I think just my life experience probably just made me question this idea that there was one story or one perspective. I mean, I think being like born in Iran and then my parents moving to England and then moving to the States, just naturally, regardless of your background or identity, I think when you move around that much, you sort of observe from the outside and you see these different stories and narratives and cultural norms. So I think as a kid, although that was hard, I think it definitely shaped the way I thought about my studies, and then I thought about my art making, and then probably just how I think about just the world. I think now it's probably many of us feel that global perspective, but I think that was a real gift. But I think it all ties in. And for me, I think the thing that I'm trying to grappling with, that I've always been kind of interested in, is how do I, I did a show with Ursula Hargens, who's a dear friend and hero. Like, she's just brilliant, but she came up with this idea for the show that we should name it Filter. And I think that's such a great word. Like, I'm interested in filtering these multiple things, but then how do you filter it into like a plate or a cup? And in some ways, I think I try to like source things from lots of different places, but maybe the way they come together, it's not like, oh, I know this comes from this one place, And I think I just constantly go back to the Silk Road. I think the visual language and the history of China, Japan, India, Pakistan, the Middle East, all the way through North Africa and Europe. I mean, that's huge, right? But all those cultures, I'm just like, there's so much there. And it's so fun to see patterns and imagery like appear somewhere and then appear somewhere else. So I think with the more recent work, like with the tulip base, I can say I was looking at Islamic architecture, but I was inspired by this. But I think you're right, with the newer work, it's like it's all kind of, as Yanagi would say, it's like I threw everything in the pot to make soup and like just let it cook for a while. So now you can't really like say, oh, there's the carrot and there's the potato. It's kind of all blended together. But I don't know. I feel like that's the work I'm most interested in, and talking about our shared humanity and our shared experiences. But honestly, sometimes when the world feels really hard and challenging, I sort of want to be more direct about those things. And that's where I am right now, to be really honest. And it's a conversation I'm having with my students a lot, where I'm so interested in this sort of poetry of making things, of finding ideas, mixing them up, putting them back out in the world. But then sometimes I just sort of want to say, like, no, this is what it is. And it's an interesting moment, I think, for me in that way. And just maybe I think we're just struggling right now to figure out how to be in the world and share ideas and feel like what we're doing, is vital, even though I know it is. So I've gone off on some tangents in your question, but it's something I think about a lot.
I love tangents. So anytime you want to take a tangent, feel free. One of the things that you've done in the last, I don't know, maybe 5 to 8 years, is that the glazes have become, you'll have a matte glaze over top of something else so that there's clarity behind fuzziness. So the front layer is sort of, not, I don't want to say obscured, but it has an energy of a veil, like you're looking through something to see something else. And I think that is so much the way we develop our identity as people, is that we live in the moment, but we look backwards and we kind of decode and think and develop meaning of who we are. But can you talk about this sense of like putting pattern over pattern and making one thing clear and making one thing kind of blurry?
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, you said it so well there. I don't know. I think that the idea of the veil, I think, is important. I think there's always something that drew me to printmaking and ceramics, this idea of layering. Like you're sort of building up an image or you're building up a surface sort of in a way that I know that painters can do, but I think printmaking and ceramics are different in the way that often it's like you put down something and then you put down something else. And it does really feel a lot like if you are in certain cultures and you sort of are trying to see through, say, a screen or see through an architectural component in different parts of the world where it's dry and it's hot. There's a lot of building spaces that are open or screens, and it's interesting, this idea of seeing through. I always connected it to architecture and art and those kind of things. I didn't really connect it to the veil, even though the veil is such a poignant, powerful symbol, and people have, tried to use it and politicize it in many ways. But it's interesting that you mentioned that, because actually I did give a talk at NCECA where I showed a picture of my mother when she was little, and I was talking about my work and just what you're saying, this idea about revealing things, concealing things, when are things really clear? And later, of course, and you mentioned Linda Sikora, she came up to me and said, that picture of your mother, I was talking about personal experiences and identity, but she connected the veil to the work in a way. And I've been thinking about that a lot, because even the veil can be really opaque. It can be translucent. It's something that women, in many ways, I think we assume that it's something that's forced on them or subjugating, but in some instances it certainly is, but in other instances it is something else, and women are choosing how to wear it and what it means for them. So it's not like, going back to that thing, it's not a single thing. It's not good or bad. It's not black or white. The veil is really complicated. But I think as human beings, there's just so much potency with this idea of who, like, we are on the outside versus the inside. The same with pots, it's like there's the shell of the pot, but really it's that volume on the inside that makes it so powerful. And the veil is this interesting intermediary. But I think in my work, what I've been trying to develop, and it's slow, but in some ways really satisfying, is how to create that sense of complexity, where I could layer and have patterns, but not to the point where it overwhelmed the object, the plate or the bowl. And over time, I realized that I didn't actually need that many parts or that many colors. Once I could play with the idea of matte or shiny, I think it really opened up what ceramics does so well. I mean, it's an amazing material, and the glazes, I don't know, it's kind of amazing just what we can do with this material. And I used to try to put everything into one pot, but at one point I did a tableware setting, a commission, and I realized that what I wanted to do was actually have every single piece be different, but have them all feel connected. So even having like a matte and a shiny as part of a set, and the way that allows us to see the pattern that you're talking about, or the floating imagery, what kind of is crisp and pops forward, and then what kind of bleeds into the background. And just, I love seeing those two things next to each other. That's like one of my favorite things right now. But I also love that I feel like I'm just scratching the surface of what's possible, and I'm excited to see where that can go. But it wasn't like a huge shift. It was just the subtle, it was the same color palette, but just going to a matte. Like, including a matte glaze in there. And I also think, something that happened to me over time was kind of actually letting go of having to see everything that I did. This is something I think about in the studio all the time. I'm sure you do, as so many of us makers think about this. You spend so much time in the studio and then you're like, oh, this thing I'm doing is just about to dissolve in the piece or disappear behind the glaze and nobody might know. But it's kind of amazing that it was part of the history or story of making the piece. And that's been super fascinating for me too. The way that the different glazes can actually, some things just completely disappear or feel like they're underwater or under snow or they're there, but they're so, or even like it's like far away in the horizon, So it's fun to embrace that part of it. Whereas I think 10 or 15 years ago, I would have found that hard or frustrating to let go of some of those things.
It's interesting how confidence as makers develops. Like, I think there's more confidence in some ways of just like, I'm going to trust this process. Yeah. I'm going to apply a pattern that's one of the things I love is that often your patterns are very gestural in the background, like the farthest background. And then there'll be something that's stenciled on top of that, which will be kind of more, I don't want to say stagnant, but more in a singular place. And then the glaze will either clarify that or erase that. And I just think like how much confidence in the process is that to just like say, this is what it is. And also just the joy of opening a kiln and going, that's what that looks like.
I think that's so true. I mean, I think no matter how we fire or what we do, I think there is something mired in clay folks, that thing about, I think there was a part of me that felt like the kiln and the firing was becoming a little bit too predictable almost, or I wanted to have that collaboration with the kiln. I think I came of age in ceramics, with the wood kiln and the salt kiln and the soda kiln. And I don't think I need that in the work anymore. But I think, like you're saying, having that be part of the process didn't feel like I was relinquishing control, but it just felt like a conversation with the work or a collaboration. And also this letting something go a little bit, thinking about, I often teach my students the history of Black Mountain College and trying to help them understand that, the way that Jenny Sorkin talks about, well, throwing on the wheel is performance. And how does someone like John Cage or this idea of chance, how does all of those things, plus the Bauhaus, like how do those things, what happens when you pull from these different places? And in my work, that's a really small part, but I love having that in play. And it keeps me more engaged too. And it feels more like the clay is an active, or the firing process is an active participant.
Can you talk about how, like, a tulip vase is super complicated? You touch that pot so often, like some of those pots, you were stamping them, you were making spouts that the tulips would come out of. It's a high touch pot. But can you contrast that with, like, let's say a plate, where the plate itself is relatively simple in its making process. The decoration's complex, but the pot itself is a low touch pot. Can you talk about like contrasting that as a maker?
Oh, Ben, those are such good questions. What do you think about that? Because do you feel like you approach it differently? We just read, my poor students, I made them read Rawson, which I love. They're always like, oh, but just what you're saying is so interesting. There are these fundamental shapes in ceramics, these typologies and morphologies. And like, what does it mean when you're making that horizontal open basin form versus kind of a taller form? It's so interesting, right? I mean, do you feel like there's do you approach them differently?
I do. I totally differently. But I also think I've been so influenced by you. I have to tell you, I've been a fan for years and I've looked at your work a ton. And I think one of the things I've learned from watching you transition between those is that the simple pot, and I know that can sound diminutive, but it's not, right. The everyday functional pot, if it's approached with a sense of reverence can give more potential after the person takes it than, say, the tulip vase, which the tulip vase is a powerhouse of form, but it is what it is. Like the tulip vase can't create conversation in the same way that, say, sitting around a table with a very simple plate and having a dinner with your family every night. Like there's almost more potential in the simple form for the emotional connection of the user than than the tulip vase, or at least that's the way I think about it.
Oh, I love that. That's so interesting. I think you're right. I think there are these fundamental differences. One of them, like you said, the sculptural complexity of the form. And I think when I was making tulip vases, I was always negotiating because the form, one really interesting thing about making something like the tulip vase for me is that I remember once like having this realization, which maybe was really obvious to someone else, but took me a while to think about, which was that with something like the tulip vase, it's like the pot itself is pattern. So the form becomes a pattern, and the way that you decide how many spouts and where's the rhythm and repetition. And like you said, will there be stamping? And so there's pattern all the way through, like from the form to the skin, to the glaze, to the color. And then there's this idea of wrapping it around a volume, but also maybe how to incorporate the spout. So it's just like the conversation and the complexity keeps kind of spinning. And I think you're right with the plates. I think that I love that idea of potential, because I think that although it seems simple because there's that one plane or one sort of clear canvas, what I think you gain too is that by focusing on that space, I think you see more of the depth, like as you would in a painting, or, when you're looking at something frontal, as opposed to, I think when you're moving around the tulip vase, I don't think there's as much, like, there's a little bit of depth in the surface, but I think there's just so much happening three-dimensionally that I think your experience is different. And for me, I think that in grad school, at least with the first tulip vases, I really kind of tried to pack in as much as I could with the form and the surface. But I think with the later tulip vases, I think the surface, I really started to want to play with the idea of pattern and structure, and not to oversimplify the surface, but to maybe back off a little bit on what was happening in the skin. Because I felt like it allowed the viewer to see the play between 2D and 3D. The plates are interesting. I even think historically we've had so many plates that were for serving food or eating food, but also a whole history of plates that people would put on the wall. And I think it's just that way to see that space, or like, thinking about large bowls or basins and what potters have done in that space. So I think you're right. In some ways, I think the plate allows me to push that more. Whereas I think with the tulip vase, I'm always like, I don't think I've made as many tulip vases, for one. And I think that the question is different. So I think I approach surface differently, but I love thinking about what you said about the way that the potential of it out in the world, right? That's a whole nother piece to consider, for sure.
As functional potters, I think the conversation, or at least the conversation that's written down in people's artist statements, is often about that potential. Like I've read so many artist statements researching people for interviews, and we basically write the same statement. The statement is essentially, we make pots to enable conversation, to create intimacy in our lives across generations. Like, we could take those two sentences and I could show you 400 artist statements that are basically the same.
No, totally. And with the implication that we're also creating like community and celebrate, like we're bringing people together through the object, which is, no, you're right. And this is the conversation I often have with students trying to write artist statements. It's how to use, there is I think as a culture, we want to have a individual point of view, but there's also, I think, this celebration that there's a history and a tradition and a universality to what we're doing, which I don't think always comes across as what necessarily we want to hear. We often want to hear like, well, what do you think? Or what's your point of view? But I love that we have this shared experience. So I think you're right. There, that's the thread. And then we're all trying to figure out how to build on that, all that tradition and history and contribute in some way. But that's so funny because I often, I should actually just have students read more artist statements, but it's interesting. You're right. There's a fundamental shared perspective there about why we do the thing we do, for sure. Yeah.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Scut is a proud sponsor of the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler. Scut Ceramic Products has been in manufacturing equipment for potters since 1953. Their reputation as a pioneer in innovative kiln design continues with the fourth generation of this family-owned business. Their KilnMaster touchscreen controller offers a sleek, smartphone-like interface that is both intuitive and packed with powerful tools that allow potters to easily program, diagnose, and remotely monitor their kilns. With 5 dedicated kiln technicians on staff and the most comprehensive network of distributors across the globe, you can be assured that Scut will be there for you before and after the sale. For more information on their line of kilns, visit scut.com. This episode of the podcast is also sponsored by Amico Brent. For the past 100 years, Amico Brent has been creating ceramic supplies for our community, ranging from underglazes to electric kilns. With over 3,000 products, Amico Brent's top priority is making sure that all of their customer needs are met. From the professional to the student and everyone in between, their high-quality materials enable you to make your best work. To learn more, check them out at amico.com or on Instagram and Facebook at Amico Brent. You can also show them how you use Amico by sharing your work online with the hashtag HowIAmico. Well, I want to go back to something you said about that you've realized that you don't have to put all the ideas on one pot. And one of the ways you've handled that is to make multiple pots that go together, either in the form of a garniture or I've seen pieces of yours. There was a really nice piece that was in a show about gardens that referenced the garden in Isfahan, the Shah Abbas's garden. And it's like multiple objects telling the story versus one object telling the story. So can you talk about bringing in this idea of like, let's make a concert of objects that tell the story as opposed to one?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I still remember in grad school, I don't know if I brought the book in, but so I was in grad school at 2000 to 2002. So it still wasn't when everybody had their phone and, we still were like, oh, here's a book and here's a book. And I can't remember who, maybe. So I was in grad school I remember this conversation with, I think it was Chad Curtis and Greg Moore, who were classmates of mine, but somebody found this book and I'm pretty sure it's Sèvres porcelain, or that period in Europe where there was the really elaborate dinner sets and like you said, I love that you brought up the conversation piece, so like centerpieces, but there was a photograph. I still have it up in my studio, actually. It's one of the few things I still have up in my studio because it's something I've never made, but I want to. I've kind of approached it, but not really, where, all the dinnerware set, I'm sure you're familiar, most people have seen it somewhere, where all the dinnerware set stacked together creates a piece, and then you take it apart and you have your dinner party. Or however, maybe the servants did it. Who knows? I can't remember. It must have been for some royal family or aristocracy. But I think going back to this idea of, I always think of my work through the lens of sort of intended function, and yet there are all these sculptural components and questions in the work. but I love this idea of, well, how do things fit together, right? It's just another super fundamental thing that artists think about. And I think when I stopped making the tulip vases and I went back to making more, being interested in tableware, I took that was an inspiration. And then just being prompted to make a few larger sets of things, I realized that that's an opportunity to bring in these other ideas. So I want to talk about that Garden of Paradise show, but I think I just want to mention that once in a while over the last few years, I've kind of made a series of tiles or done a like screen printing thing on the wall just to get away from this kind of intimate space of the object and make a series. And I feel like those pieces weren't necessarily successful or even like resolved, but they just allow my brain to kind of play in a way that is good for my everyday practice. So I've kind of tried these different things over the years. When it came to that Garden of Paradise show, I had been working for a while on this large dinner set that I was making for somebody. And I really wanted that dinner set to be like the original Sèvres. I really wanted it to all fit together and then come apart. And I didn't approach that because it was just kind of overwhelming to get it done. But I love this idea that you're talking about where the pieces are in conversation with each other, then people are in conversation, and making this dinnerware set where it's all one set, but depending where you sit, you're going to have a different dinnerware set. I think I was thinking about all of that. And then the Garden of Paradise show was really intended to be a collaboration where 5 people were sharing ideas, and the work was intended to be connected and really kind of rooted in the complexity of what is the Middle East? How do we define its boundaries? How do we talk about the Middle East with all these different ethnic groups, religions, conflicts as a place, but then to an American audience? How do we celebrate the beauty of the Middle East? And I just kept coming back to the idea of the garden. I just think the garden is this another universal, really powerful place that everybody knows something about a garden. But thinking about the Islamic garden and the way those gardens took shape in, especially in Iran, because I had seen them, I just thought I was looking through some books, and I kept going back to Esfahan, as you mentioned, and it's just such a beautiful city. And I don't know that it has the same, like, I think since Iran has sort of not been part of the global conversation for so long, I don't know that many people, unless there's a reason to, kind of know the history and the beauty of Esfahan and what an important city it was, and that the whole city is sort of built around the Meidun, or the garden. And so I was just looking at these beautiful aerial shots of the garden and saw them as shapes and saw them as like objects. And so I decided to just make, it's somewhat abstract, but all the shapes were meant to kind of, if you put them together, would kind of be that aerial view of the main garden that the Shah built. And of course, what was fun about it was that I was kind of stuck. I didn't know how to make work for this show. And once I decided that, it became much more like a garden. Like, I had the framework, but then I started to play. And what I even love about that show was that, part out of necessity and part out of just trusting, like you said, to try it, the test tiles and the cardboard templates were in the piece alongside the clay work. And I don't know, it felt much more like a garden. It felt much more like when I'm in my garden and I need something, how do I grab things? How do I organize the garden? But I also wanted to kind of honor the incredible garden that was Esfahan, that is Esfahan, and just this idea that, I don't know, I just felt like I scratched the surface of something again, but I couldn't figure out how to do it all. Like, the scale of it was beyond one thing. But I think this is a really interesting thing because I think potters, we're often working in a series or making more than one piece. They might go out in the world on their own, but I don't know if you feel this way. Sometimes in my studio, when I have 8 plates, I I know they're individual, but for some reason I see them as a group. And I think that's how I see like tiles when I make a series of them, or more specifically the Garden of Paradise piece. So I might have kind of gone off on a thread there, but it's interesting how different these pieces are. But then I think I still work on them as a group. And I don't think anybody would like look at it and see Esfahan without the text, but I couldn't have made the piece without um, that sort of parameter or framework, and that was really really fun. But the idea of garden is also something I love, and I feel like the way gardeners will say like the work is never done, I feel like that about the work too, like the studio work, like it just never feels done.
The Garden of Paradise show was so beautiful in that when you're looking down from above, you see all these parts that fit together, much like you mentioned tiles. If you're looking at mosque tile, you'll have, the star coming into the other shape. There's like this linking thing. But what's nice about a garden is that there's walkways. So there's this like ability to go in and out. And I love that piece because once I understood what it was, it allowed my imagination to, I've never been to Isfahan, but I felt like I could walk through the garden in that experience, and that is something that pots don't often give me that feeling. That's what I love about that piece specifically, is that there was something my imagination could take hold of that Garden of Paradise show in a way that singular pots can't. There was something just so beautiful about that.
Well, I so appreciate your saying that, because you talked about confidence in my work. I think I felt so vulnerable when I made that piece because it felt very raw. And, the other thing is at some point you're like, well, what does it mean to put this work out in the world? But I actually feel like it was so important to do that, to give that space for myself and for the viewers. So it's amazing to hear you say that, because that's what I was hoping for. But there was also a risk in that I really scrambled, but I think that it was one of the few times where I felt like I was in grad school again, where I was just thinking, like, what's the idea? And I thought so much that I basically froze. And then I knew I just had to start making and then letting that kind of come out in some way. But it felt very raw at the moment. But then a few years later, I've just recently been having conversations again with people about that piece. And so it's really interesting that it's coming up again. And I'm really hoping in a few years to try to have a second iteration with the other artists. So we'll see. Fingers crossed. But I'm so glad that you brought that piece up. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to wrap up talking about your teaching. You've mentioned that you'll have conversations with students, and as I was doing research, I saw that your position is listed as the professor of pottery. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes. Uh-huh.
That's amazing, because usually it's professor of ceramics, professor of three-dimensional studies, professor of whatever, but you're a professor of pottery.
Isn't that amazing? And I might be Del as well. Because even though he's a ceramic sculptor, we both decided that we didn't want to change the name. And I don't know of any other academic, maybe non-academic setting, but I don't know any other academic. I would love to know if there are other pottery areas, but you're right. The majority of programs in the United States are called ceramics. Honestly, when I was looking for jobs, I was like, wait, what? But then when I came here and I got a little bit more of a sense of the history, I was really grateful that it was called pottery. And I was also really grateful that we weren't forced to change it. But, this goes back to I think language and history. So my predecessor was Richard Devore. And he came to CSU Fort Collins after teaching at Cranbrook. So he taught at Cranbrook, I don't know, maybe 20 years. I'm not sure, 15, 20 years. And was, very celebrated and one of the main figures in the field. And he chose to come here. And I don't know if he chose the name, but I know that he wanted to keep it the pottery program. But after being here for a few years and talking it over with Dell, once Dell got hired 3 years after I did, we really thought about it. And I think historically, pottery had a broader definition. I think now we sort of think ceramics is the broad word and pottery is more specific to the vessel or the container, even if it's an abstract. But we teach our students the broad range, right? We have sculptors, we have potters, we have, our students do all kinds of things. But I love that, if you you can pull a book off the shelf and it'll say pottery, Chinese pottery, and it'll be figurines. So I think historically, pottery was, anything made out of clay. It wasn't specific to pots. And I think there's just a little part of me that loves that and loves that it prompts the question and we're a little bit different. And I hope that as long as I'm here that we can keep the name, but we're kind of trying to we're still thinking about it in that broader way. I also, just to plug our university a little bit and just the state of contemporary craft, I also, I'm grateful to be where I am because I know there's very few university programs that have a metals and jewelry, fibers and pottery. And so that's also been a real blessing for me and for my students that I have colleagues in the craft areas and we can, it's really wonderful to have that just vibrant material culture and just physical material exploration happening in all these different disciplines. So, but yeah, no, it's fun to talk about that. I had a few colleagues ask me when we first got hired, can we change the name? Can we become part of the contemporary conversation? And I think they're all okay with it now once we talked about it. But I think it's great for the students too, because we talk about that. They ask the question, why is it called the pottery area? I'm like, well, I don't exactly know, but we're not changing the name.
Well, what I like about it is that it seems to be melding the idea that craft is not a dirty word, so we're not going to hide that history, but also we're contemporary artists working in this genre. This is a genre. This is not we're not playing second fiddle to contemporary art. This is contemporary art in this moment. So Absolutely. when I saw that, I was so excited.
Yay!
To wrap up, can you plug your website and then social media if people wanted to get in touch?
Oh yeah, I'd love to. So both, just my name, Sanam Emami. So if you search Sanam Emami online or sanamemami.com, that's my website. And then also, after many years of not being on social media, I am finally on Instagram and really enjoying it. It's been really, really fun way to connect. And so also Sanam Emami. I will say a really funny thing when I got on social media, because I was never on Facebook. And so it was really interesting to get onto Instagram. I'm not sure when it was, and see that someone had created an account for me. And there was a picture of Tula Base up there. And I was like, that is so cool. Somebody has already done that. But mine is just my name, Sanam Emami. That's how you can find me on Instagram. So there's another floating account. I can't remember what it is, but I won't respond if you reach out to that one.
Well, it was good to talk to you today. I appreciate your time.
Well, Ben, I just wanted to also say how much I admire you and your work and all the things you're doing for the field. Your work is phenomenal, and I just appreciate your curiosity and your generosity. And I just think all these conversations are just a wealth of resources for our students and our colleagues and, for future folks working in the discipline. But thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed it.
I'd like to thank Sanam for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to talk with her. Before we go, I wanted to thank today's sponsors, the first of which is Bailey. They make a variety of ceramic products, including some amazing large-scale kilns. So if you want to go big, go Bailey. You can find out more at baileypottery.com. Our second sponsor for today is Amico Brent, who has been creating ceramic supplies for the community for over 100 years. If you'd like to find out more about what they have to offer, you can go to amico.com. And lastly, I'd like to thank Scut Ceramic Products for also sponsoring this episode of the show. Their KilnMaster touchscreen controller offers a sleek, smartphone-like interface that makes it easy for you to program, diagnose, and remotely monitor your kilns. For more information, visit scut.com. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities whose lands we reside on in the United States, and recognize that we are uninvited guests on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of over 500 nations indigenous to North America. By acknowledging and reflecting upon the contemporary lived experiences and histories of the Indigenous peoples here and globally, we may begin to take essential steps towards creating a more equitable world. Learn more through the hashtag Honor Native Land initiative of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and consider contributing to Indigenous-led organizations doing important work to further health and wellness, sovereignty, and self-determination of the first people of the lands you reside. This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.